Okay, so remember that we are going to be going over one unit per day, basically for the rest of class, and I'm going to give you a couple of day of maybe doing practice tests, questions. And remember that if you are not here because you have a required class test for one of your college classes, then you can just look up on YouTube. I already have these done on YouTube. I could have just sent you on to YouTube like I've done all year, but I wanted this time to do it with you so that you could ask any lingering questions you might have had, and I can kind of expand on what's in the notes. Okay, so first thing is let's go into the agricultural revolution. Now, this is way back from the very, very first lecture that we ever did. And basically, this was a revolution, and actually, it happened in a lot of places, not just in Mesoamerica. That's where we talk about it because it contrasts with what happened with a lot of what happened in present-day United States. Okay, so someone tell me that before agricultural revolutions started to take place, how did civilizations operate? And just again, I've got all the pictures taken out. It's just going to tell me who's talking. It's just going to show me the first name. Just speak up if you'd like to say so. How did people live and why did, or yeah, how did people live before the agricultural revolution and why?
They were usually nomadic, like hunter-gatherer type of tribes.
Very good. And what forced them, Logan, to be nomadic?
Because they didn't have agriculture and they had to move around with different animals and herds, trying to collect food as they went.
Yep, perfect. And remember, there's the idea that originally there were no human beings in the Americas, but then when the Ice Age happened and you had that land bridge connection between what is now Alaska and Russia, people followed the herds over that over the course of thousands of years, and then you had multiple civilizations blossom in the New World because of that. Now, why was, and again, thank you, Logan, someone else, tell me, why did the agricultural revolution primarily happen in Mesoamerica, like basically modern day Mexico, Central America, and northern South America?
Because it had like a warm climate and that's how crops could grow.
Yeah, you could grow crops there for yourself. You could store them up for the winter, which is even better. And you could feed them to livestock, which people started to domesticate. Now, in the New World, pretty much the llama was the only one being domesticated. But they still were able to domesticate animals. They could, I guess they ate llamas sometimes. I've never had llama. I don't know if it's really something that you eat. But still, they domesticated animals, which means they could use them for food or work. And of course, they could grow plants and stay in one place. Now, if you can stay in one place, you don't need a teepee. It's kind of like whenever I go backpacking. When I go backpacking, I literally have to carry everything on my back, hence the name backpacking. So I have to have a tent. If I was staying in one place for a couple of years, would I have a tent or would I build myself a more permanent shelter? That sort of thing. So as you can see in the picture, people just started to build more permanent structures. They started to stay in one place. And because they weren't spending all their time chasing food around, because they had it either fenced in or they had a garden growing or something like that, they had time to devote to other things. So you'll see the development of sciences, mathematics, calendar making, different technological innovations like aqueducts to deliver water, things like that. And of course, with a healthier diet, more steady diet, you're going to see people living a little bit longer. You're going to see reproduction rates grow, and you're going to start to see basically cities start to form. And if you remember correctly, the old Aztecs, they actually had cities that were bigger than cities that were in some places in Europe. One note, and I bet some of you are doing this already. One note, real quick, is that I want you to do one of two things. Either write this along with me and then pause when you're done, or just do it all ahead of time so you can just sit and listen. Don't be doing like number 5 while I'm doing number 1, because if you're hearing one thing and writing another, it doesn't stick as well. So I'm hoping that you all got that. Okay, moving on to the next thing. So this is the single most important thing that came out of the first lecture. It's one of the most important things that came out of the entire first unit, and that's the Columbian Exchange. So the Columbian Exchange, I've got a few things that in my own mind I would consider like top 5 or top 10 turning points in world history. I think that Jesus would be one. I think Muhammad would be one because of how they both transformed the religious world, which also led to conflicts later on over religion. Uh, I think the development of the atomic bomb was one because that was the time that human beings developed the ability to basically wipe themselves out and life on Earth. I also think the Columbian Exchange counts as one of those top 5, if not top 10, if not top 5 moments in history where things were just completely changed. So all of a sudden, you've got, once the land bridge is gone, you've got all of these developments that happen over thousands and thousands of years in the Western Hemisphere, and they're different from what happens in the Eastern Hemisphere or the Old World and the New World. And remember, the Old World means basically Africa, Asia, and Europe, and the New World is basically meaning the Americas. That's what and of course there's some issues with how they're named, but we don't need to get into that now. But remember, it's basically like two different worlds on one planet, and all of a sudden they come into contact with each other. And once they come into contact with each other, there's this whole exchange of ideologies and products, plants, animals, diseases, all these things. It would be like if aliens visited the world or Earth, they visited Earth, and then all of a sudden there's a huge exchange of things that happen. Now, someone tell me the most significant things, or just tell me one and why it's significant. And then I'll let someone else follow up with another.
The diseases that were spread.
Okay, diseases. Which one would be the most, probably the most impactful disease?
Smallpox.
Smallpox. Okay, good. So remember smallpox, it wipes out the Aztecs largely. Eventually it spreads to the Powhatans in the Virginia area. It spreads to the Wampanoags and some other groups that were in the New England area. And I think I might have said in my screencast that there are estimates that up to 90% of the original Native American population were wiped out. Is that going to make them easier to conquer?
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, Jason. Somebody else give me another one.
Gold.
I didn't see who was talking, but first name?
Leah.
Leah? Okay, so Leah, yes, gold's a big deal because gold is going to be found in certain places of the New World. Remember how the Aztecs had a lot of it and Cortez wanted it. Well, word gets out, ooh, there's gold in the Americas. How much gold there was, they didn't really start to really find out till like, the California gold rush. But they didn't know there was gold there. And so a ton of old world countries are so all of a sudden thirsty for the new world because they want to get gold or silver, but gold's the big driver. Remember, God, gold, and glory. And the desire for gold kind of fed into this larger kind of power struggle among old world countries. And can anyone kind of, I don't know if I'm leading you in the right direction with this, but gold fed into what theory about becoming a powerful country? That's a tougher one.
Mercantilism?
Perfect. Good job, Ava. So mercantilism, remember the idea that if you form colonies, then you don't have to buy stuff from other people. If you can get it from your own colonies, you get more gold than everybody else has because there's only so much gold in the world. And then the wealthier you are, the more powerful you are. And remember, mercantilism played into that conflict. And of course, it draws people over. It drew the Jamestown settlers over, and then that almost became a disaster. But more on that later. Okay, someone give me another thing from the Columbian Exchange that's a big deal.
Cultivation of new crops like corn.
Okay, I didn't see who was talking, but I think it was Cy. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're looking at the second row there, right in here. So which one of those products, Cy, would be the most important going forward?
Tobacco?
Tobacco, because it becomes like Jamestown's gold, and we'll talk more about that later. But remember, people aren't addicted to gold. People can get addicted to tobacco, so it can be quite a good seller. The problem is who's going to do the labor to harvest the tobacco? And that's not a rhetorical question. Who is going to do the labor first?
Indentured servants.
Very good. Again, I didn't see the name pop up. Who was that one? I think that was a new person.
That was Leah.
Oh, Leah again. Okay, okay, Leah, indentured servants, and then you have another big turning point occur, an event that impacts indentured servants. Can anyone tell me what that one was?
The triangle trade.
That's something that develops over time between the New World and the Old World. It does involve tobacco and other products, but there's a singular event that happens in Virginia that impacts indentured servitude.
Bacon's Rebellion.
Very good, Amy. Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion. So for some of you, the name's popping up, some's not. Whatever. So Bacon's Rebellion. Then after Bacon's Rebellion, remember, it becomes apparent that indentured servants aren't going to work. And if you look down here at the bottom, slave labor, that's where slavery becomes, kind of starts to really take hold. And of all those things, that's the main thing. Keep in mind also that the Spaniards brought horses over, which helped out the Native Americans. And remember that the Spaniards and the French got along with the Native Americans overall better, although the English definitely by far got along with them worse. By the way, there was a form of slavery that occurred before African slavery. I just kind of had that light bulb moment this school year with thinking about it, but there was another form of slave labor before African slavery. Can anyone remember that one?
Was it indentured servants?
No, because they did it voluntarily. So they signed a contract and it ended up being a stinky contract, but it still was a contract, and they could, if they made it, live to the end of their contract.
Was it the Native Americans and the Spanish?
Very good. That's impressive. Because I don't think I put it on the list of things here. I might have, but encomienda system, if you remember that, where they said, "Oh, we've converted to Catholicism. We got to make sure you're a good Catholic and enslave you," that sort of thing. So it actually existed beforehand, but remember that with African slave labor, it eventually becomes not just an economic thing, but a race-based thing that we still see leftovers of today. Remember, that was a big focus of the class. I'll speed it up a little bit. I know I'm going a little bit slow. Here's another turning point. The fall of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Why is it a turning point? I guess some of you are busy writing down, but think, why would the fall of the Spanish Armada, what would Spain losing a naval battle over near England, why would that have any impact on the
Wouldn't it make England more powerful in the old world and more able to conquer the new world?
All of the above. Yeah, that's correct. And we'll get a lot more into what having a strong Navy, what that means for a country in American too. For example, basically one of the reasons that we're able to beat Japan, and really Germany and Italy too, but definitely Japan in World War II, was because of our naval capabilities. Why did we win the Spanish-American War in 1898 and only took us 4 months? Our Navy. So a Navy is a big deal. Remember, most of the world's covered in water, and if you control the water, you control trade between nations. It matters a lot, and you'll see that play into America too a lot more. But for right now, Spain is starting its decline with the fall of the Spanish Armada. Now England can start settling its colonies. Remember that England tried to settle colonies a little bit before 1588, but they failed, like the Lost Colony, for example. But remember, soon after this, in 1607, you got Jamestown, and then it just goes on from there. 1620, you've got Plymouth and the separatist Puritans and all that. So yes, this opens the door for English settlement, and that is why you see so much English influence in American culture, because eventually it's the English colonies that, through manifest destiny, they become states, and then through manifest destiny, they end up taking over a lot of land all the way to the Pacific. Okay, so southern colonies, I'll just speak about them generally. And you got to remember that geography, climate, weather patterns, all that stuff, that really plays heavily into how a colony or a state or an area how they developed. Now, one thing I don't like about this map is that it doesn't include Virginia, which is right in here. It shows it there. Virginia would be considered a southern colony. It was a special southern colony, just like Maryland, because it was along this body of water, the Chesapeake. Remember, those were the Chesapeake colonies, the first of the southern colonies. But what they all had in common is that they had a longer growing season, almost like Mesoamerica in a way. In fact, the Native Americans there, like the Cherokee, had formed civilizations to a degree. That was the only part of what became the United States that was very similar to Mesoamerica. Anyway, so because they are dependent on agriculture, and not just tobacco, things like rice and indigo as well, but mainly tobacco at first. Eventually cotton. Someone tell me what makes people turn to cotton a whole lot more?
Slavery?
Well, slavery was there for tobacco at first, but why did slaves suddenly go for cotton? Or why did slave owners make their slaves start working in cotton a lot more? What invention? That's another turning point.
Oh, the cotton gin?
Very good, cotton gin. So keep that in mind. That's coming. We're not there yet. Okay, so because these original colonies that became states were so dependent on agriculture and slaves to basically do the hard labor in this agricultural economy, will the future southern United States be dependent on slavery?
The southern states would be dependent on slavery, yeah.
Yeah, and who would not be as dependent on slavery to the point where they eventually get rid of it?
Northern states.
Yes, northern states. Now, originally, again, all the colonies had slavery, but the northern colonies, once they became states, were like, oh yeah, we said all men are created equal. Oh yeah, we believe in natural rights. And oh yeah, we don't really need slaves anyway, so it's not really going to hurt our economy. So we got other people we can take advantage of, which would be the poor factory workers and eventually immigrants. Anyway, so more on the southern colonies. Again, just speak up if I'm going too fast. So Jamestown will be the first of the English settlements. It will be located in Virginia. For a time, it will be the capital of Virginia until it gets burned down during Bacon's Rebellion. So they almost collapse because they go there, they look for gold, and they don't find gold. How do they get along with the Native Americans at first?
Wasn't it pretty good?
It was pretty good out of necessity. They were new there. They didn't know how things were going very well. And by the way, I've actually been in this little spot right here, what's left of it, which isn't a whole lot, over in when I went on a trip to Virginia once. It was actually not as interesting as I had hoped it would be, but whatever. Anyway, so that's a side note. Where'd my mouse go? There it is. Okay, so yeah, there it is. And I think this part was the more important part. That's why I had bigger walls around it, which you can still see today. Or they might have reconstructed it, but still you see the walls there today. So they got along well. They were way outnumbered by the Powhatan Native Americans. They needed the Powhatan Native Americans' help. And so they got along. Now, eventually they don't get along so well because when the starving time comes along, which was, caused largely by a drought that they had no control over, desperate for food, sometimes I got the one story of the guy that killed his wife so he could eat her because he was so hungry, and you got other forms of cannibalism happening. But that also hurts the relationship with the Powhatan because they're like, ooh, the Powhatan been around for a while. They've got stuff stored up. Let's go steal food from their villages. So that is going to create tension. Now, once tobacco comes along and Jamestown recovers and they become self-sufficient, they grow in number. Do they need the Powhatan's help anymore?
No.
They don't. So what happens to the relationship between them and the Native Americans?
It turns more like unnecessary. I'm sorry about
Unnecessary to be pleasant or good. And so they basically start to fight them. And then eventually, by the end of the whole affair, there are literally no Powhatans left on their own ancestral land. And that represents a pattern that you see long-term in American history, which is, by the way, can y'all see me at all?
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm talking with my hands some, and I was wondering if I was doing it unnecessarily. Okay, so this is a trend that's going to go on throughout American history, one, and going into American history two. And you see leftovers of that even now. And that is the treatment of Americans and their colonial ancestors toward the Native Americans. So someone give me other examples that you've already learned about that kind of represent this idea that we will not share land with Native Americans, which the French and the Spanish were willing to do.
They made false promises and kept taking more and more from the Native Americans.
That's the overall trend, but give me specific examples.
The Trail of Tears.
Didn't they make a?
Trail of Tears. Yeah, go ahead, Si.
I was gonna say, didn't they make a document where like the Native Americans would have land, but then they would like impede on the colonists kind of like quote unquote own land, and like that would started a big thing.
That's
Are you talking about Florida, maybe?
I don't know. I thought there was a document that they made. They might not have.
No, okay. How about Treaty of Greenville? Is that what you're thinking? Proclamation of 1763. Proclamation of 1763 probably wouldn't quite fit the model because the king actually wanted to keep the two from fighting over land at that point. But Treaty of Greenville, remember we said, okay, you can have this part of the Northwest Territory and we'll just keep our own until we crossed over it. And then that's when Tecumseh kind of rises up. You got the Battle of Tippecanoe and all that. You got the Trail of Tears, which was caused by the Indian Removal Act. And then in Unit 1 of American 2, we'll start talking about the reservation system where we don't really have a place to shove them anymore because we push them west so many times. So we start putting them on the pieces of land we don't want. And then they basically have their own starving times. And even now, Native Americans, some of them were saying, hey, why don't you give us back some of the land that you took from us long, long ago. I've heard that they've already, I saw this news article recently that Native Americans that are still on reservations today were calling on President-elect Biden to basically, hey, give us back the land, which to be honest, I don't see ever happening. Do we live with the leftovers of how we treated the Native Americans, or does our country? Absolutely. If you've ever been to a Native American reservation, the majority of people there are living in poverty, even now. So still live with it. Okay, so again, I'll try to speed up. It's kind of hard for me too now that I'm live and not having to go as fast for a screencast on YouTube, and I'm trying to go in depth. Okay, so remember that tobacco, somebody say something? No? Okay, so tobacco, remember, becomes the new gold for Jamestown. It becomes so valuable and the demand becomes incredibly high over in the old world that they have to grow more and more, which means they need more and more land, hence fighting with Powhatan over land access, which they win, especially because they spread smallpox to the Powhatan. But they also need someone to tend to this land, and initially it's the indentured servants till Bacon's Rebellion, then later on it becomes slaves. And they did this to keep up with the, addiction, tobacco addiction or nicotine addiction driven demand from the old world. Tobacco is so valuable that instead of carrying around money in Jamestown, they would pay each other in tobacco leaves sometimes. And again, remember that the shift from indentured servants to slaves is caused by Bacon's Rebellion. And I'll try to remember, but there's a test question that you all tend to miss. Every class I have tend to miss this, and it's a question about the significance of Bacon's Rebellion. So let me correct that whenever I get to Bacon's Rebellion. Okay. Interestingly / ironically, whenever the first slaves, African slaves, appeared in the colonies, you also saw the House of Burgesses established. This happened in 1619. Not that you have to memorize dates, but it's going to be the first representative government in the colonies. It will be in Virginia. And there's a couple reasons why this is noteworthy. And both of these reasons deal with the coming of the American Revolution and the impact of the American Revolution. So speak up if you have any idea of one of the two reasons why this is important.
It was the first local government, I guess.
The key word there is local. Okay.
Yeah.
So remember, they're getting used to governing themselves. Granted, it was very limited. You had to be rich, white, and male in order to participate in this, but it still was a form of representative government and local government. Basically, remember that the king or the queen of England, no, they're laying off. England's government's laying off. If they're 3,000 miles away, it's kind of impractical. So people get used to doing things their own way and representing themselves. And of course, whenever King George III decides to clamp down and say, no, you're going to do things my way, that's not going to go over well because people are used to, governing their own affairs at a local level. And you still see that today. That's kind of one of the kind of parts of the Republican Party is this idea of more local, like state, the whole idea of states' rights in a sense, but the whole idea of state or local government versus a big federal government. Because who knows the needs of Iredell County better, Iredell County governors or the federal government, that kind of thing. Okay, what's the second thing that is very important about this?
It paved the road for democracy.
Almost. You're so close. Let me stay with you, Cy. It paved the road for a democratic what?
Republic.
Perfect. So remember that a republic has is where you have people that are elected to represent on your behalf, and that way you don't have 300 plus million people going to Washington to vote on stuff. So you represent people to vote on your behalf. That's really talked about in Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And then if they don't do what they're supposed to do, you vote them out of office. And I don't know how well we're living up to that ideal now. Congress's approval rating is in the teens. Not kidding. It's like between 10 and 20% usually. But the ideal is that you'll have people govern on your behalf. Now, once they're there, they use democratic principles like majority rule in the Senate or majority rule in the House of Representatives to make decisions. So you have elements of democracy in our republic. So a democratic republic would be a more accurate way to put it, or you could say a constitutional democratic republic, since all the ground rules are set up by a constitution. Okay, very good, side. Okay, next thing. Remember that there is definitely going to be a power imbalance in the colonies because, let me check the time. Might be going a little bit too slow. Might have to speed it up or send you to the YouTube channel at the end of this. We'll see. I'm experimenting here. Okay, so head-right system. If you were one of the rich people that needed indentured service to harvest your land, then basically the English government said, sure, go ahead. Bring over 10 indentured servants. They'll work for you for 4 to 7 years. And for every one you bring over, you get 50 acres of land. So if you bring over 10 people, you get 500 acres of land, and they're going to do the work for you in exchange for their passage to the New World. So who gets to gobble up all of the land?
Is it the rich colonial men?
Yeah, you'd say wealthy planters, like it says there, is usually the term that's given to it, but yes. And remember, they are also the only ones that get to vote for people in the House of Burgesses. So is the House of Burgesses going to pass laws that help out the indentured servants even after they're free? No. It's going to pass laws that are in favor of the wealthy planters. And because of this lack of representation, because of this lack of power, this power imbalance, it does feed into Bacon's Rebellion. Remember that Bacon's Rebellion was not indentured servants. It was indentured servants that had finished out their contracts and were now free, and they were realizing that all the good land was gone, and the House of Burgesses wouldn't help them with their conflicts with Native Americans, etc. Okay, so indentured servants themselves, there's another picture of them, or that shows that idea. Notice that they're harvesting tobacco. And again, they would sign a contract, and they would, if they did something like they got so poor and desperate that they stole something, they could have that 4 to 7 years. It could be extended 8 or 9 years. They did this because they want a new opportunity in the United States. And it doesn't take forever for word to get back to England that indentured servitude is not all it's cracked up to be, because usually you get really bad land and no representation in government. in the New World. And so indentured servants, they're going to start to dwindle, and the number of people that sign the contract starts to dwindle, and the ones that are already over here, once they become free, get angrier and angrier. So, and there's going to be a rebellion. So basically the abandoning of indentured servitude as a cheap labor source, that abandonment is kind of a long time coming. Okay, and so it leads to Bacon's Rebellion, which is huge. And there is a picture, I believe it's supposed, I think that's supposed to be Bacon. No, I can't remember if I guess he lived, he died during the rebellion. I guess he lived long enough to see Jamestown burn, because I think that's what's happening there. But he does die, and then the rebellion is squashed, and a bunch of people get executed for it and all that. And so there was a test question that I used multiple times, and it was, why was basically Bacon's Rebellion significant? This is another one of those big turning points. It really sets the tone for race relations in the United States for the rest of history up to this point. We still live with some of the leftovers of that. So whenever people took the test, a lot of people said the significance of Bacon's Rebellion, they put down Jamestown's burned to the ground. Well, yeah, that's a big deal. They burned the Capitol. They sent the governor running. The Capitol had to be moved to Williamsburg, eventually Richmond. But that's not what's mostly significant. What's mostly significant is that it changed the labor source to slavery. Are we going to be dealing with slavery constantly, pretty much throughout American history? One, yes. And slavery and the slave codes lead to racism, and we deal with racism up until present day. So Bacon's Rebellion, long time ago, but the butterfly effect of it on our history is pretty profound. Okay, again, slow me down if I'm going too fast. I'm trying to speed up a little bit so I get everything into the 35 minutes. Okay, so the New England colonies, remember that they are largely founded on the idea of not freedom of religion for all, but freedom for their religion, which would have been separatist Puritanism, and eventually the non-separatists come in, but generally speaking, it's for the Puritans. Okay, they could farm, but they couldn't farm a lot. So they had to do more manufacturing. So they had to do blacksmithing or barrel making or making ships. Remember, there was a lot of timber there, especially in what is now Maine, used to be part of Massachusetts. So if they're already used to building stuff, that's kind of setting the groundwork for what kind of economy once they become states later on.
An industrialized economy?
Yes, an industrialized economy. So when the Industrial Revolution comes along, boom, it happens in the New England area. And of course, down south, they're not worrying, but they're based on slave-based agriculture or poor white-based agriculture, because not everybody owns slaves. I don't know if I ever told you this, but only like a quarter of people owned any slaves, and most only owned a couple. But anyway, that's another notion to come back to later on. So the shipbuilding thing, remember that when the Civil War comes along, the northern states had a longer history of shipbuilding, and they had the factories to build them with, so they're able to execute things like the Anaconda Plan. So keep that in mind too. By the way, does anyone know what the name of this little piece of land is?
Is it Rhode Island?
Here's Rhode Island right here.
Cape Cod.
Cape Cod, that's Cape Cod. That's where basically Plymouth Rock is supposed to be, I think, though I've never seen it because I hear it's a big letdown. But notice it's called Cape Cod. Why? Because fishing was also a big deal, and cod fishing was a big deal in that area. Okay, moving forward. So Mayflower Compact, it's kind of setting the groundwork for some of our democratic values that we have in our country. Now, we do have a republic, but again, like I said before, how our laws pass, once we elect the representatives use majority rule. And actually, that's very applicable in the 2020 election, because right now, the Democrats have a majority in the House of Representatives, but they don't in the Senate. But there's some elections coming up. If you've been watching the news, there's 2 runoff elections coming up for 2 Senate seats. If the Democrats win both of them, it'll be 50-50, and the vice president will be a Democrat, and they'll have majority rule in the Senate. And if they lose even one of those Senate seats, then they will not have majority rule in the Senate. So majority rule definitely takes, it's definitely a big deal once you get the representatives in there. That's why it's both Democratic and a Republic kind of mixed. But Mayflower Compact kind of lays the groundwork for that idea. They had written down that they were going to create a government and they were going to implement use of majority rule. Eventually they abandoned that. They go with consensus. You can do that in small towns, but once the population grows, consensus is a lot harder to get. Just look at how divided people are over the 2020 election. Okay. Speaking of writing things down, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, I honestly couldn't tell you a thing about what they say or what the document says. That's not what's important. What's important is that you got a colony, Connecticut, that's actually forming a constitution. Eventually, the United States forms a constitution that does not work. What was that constitution called?
Articles of Confederation.
Good. Gave too little power to the central federal government. Meanwhile, each of the states come up with their own constitutions. And then when the Constitution is written to replace Articles of Confederation, it largely borrows from some of the state constitutions, including creating a Bill of Rights to add to it eventually. But the reason that the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut are important is because it, again, like it says there, it foreshadowed the formation of a constitution that we still live under today. What is the oldest surviving democratic republic in the world right now?
America?
United States, which is interesting. A lot of people don't realize that. And you know, what's interesting is that since our country formed as a democratic republic, other ones have attempted or have successfully become those kind of nations. For example, you saw the French Revolution happen shortly after ours. Look at Japan after we defeated them in World War II. They went from a fascist military dictatorship to a democratic republic. So that's, I mean, we have, quote, spread democracy or democratic republic ideals to other countries. You see that in a lot of you know, European nations, especially Western European nations, where you used to have monarchies, and now even if you have a king or queen of England, they don't really have that much real power. Things are still run more like a democratic republic. Rockman, is Pakistan, is that considered a democratic republic right now, or how would you classify that?
It has a parliament, so it would have that type of a system, whatever that has. Does America have a parliament?
We have a Congress, which is, so far as I know, pretty similar, if not the same thing.
I think it's based off of UK government, whatever they have.
Okay, so yeah, basically you could, they probably elect representatives and then they vote on laws.
Yep, yes, yes, sir.
Yep, so there you see how this ideal spreads, which is pretty big deal. We kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of countries. Okay, so eventually remember that the Pilgrims that went to Plymouth, Puritans, they set up their own little colony called Plymouth, but eventually what happens is there's going to be a lot of persecution of Puritans in England, and so they all rush over to the New World. They form the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it ends up absorbing Plymouth. And even though the separatist Puritans and the, I guess, regular Puritans didn't agree on everything, they did agree on purifying the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, just had different ways of doing it. So both of them, well, once Plymouth is absorbed into Massachusetts Bay, they're going to be run by John Winthrop, who I don't know if he's supposed to be pictured there or not, but it's run by John Winthrop, and he wants Massachusetts to be a city upon a hill, which was basically quoting Bible passages. I think it might actually be quoting Jesus himself, and the idea was we're going to be a beacon unto the world. We're going to be a Christian example to the world. Now, how well is that going to work out long term?
Slavery came in the way?
Not slavery. They end up getting rid of slavery eventually. But remember that just because they're enthusiastic about religion doesn't mean their kids are going to be, or their grandkids. You know, the stereotypical preacher kid being wild when the preacher's very not wild. Not that I'm endorsing stereotypes, but I'm just saying that that's kind of an idea that's in a lot of people's heads. That's basically what happens is, yeah, they were religious, kids and grandkids, not so much. It's going to take a great awakening, a revival period, that the first great awakening basically, to get people religious again. But right now, their initial goal is to be religious and show everybody. Now, Roger Williams was very religious. He was very much a Puritan, but he differed from the leadership of Massachusetts Bay because he said that basically you can't just be a Christian because you're being told to by your government. He said you got to have free will. You have to be able to choose a religion. If you are forced into a religion, you're basically nothing more than a robot, even though robots didn't exist back then, but you get the idea. You have to believe on your own. And if that means your neighbors don't believe and you do, well, that's fine. So he was way ahead of his time, at least for that area, because he believed in religious tolerance. And so he ends up getting ousted out of Massachusetts, and he goes and he forms his own colony. Real quickly, someone tell me what colony he forms.
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island. And then the other Puritans look at Rhode Island as like this sewer of outcasts that aren't true Christians because they allow non-Christians to be around them. And remember, the separatists never wanted to be around non-Puritans. So anyway, he believed in freedom of religion and ended up forming his own colony, which lays the groundwork for our First Amendment, which has tolerance of religion, of all religions. Okay? So just like in the southern colonies, you're going to see conflict with the Native Americans. Remember that the Puritans believed that if you did what God wanted, God would bless you. If you weren't a good Christian, then God would curse you. And then they start seeing all the Native Americans dying from smallpox. And they're like, see, that's what happens to savages that don't believe in Christianity. That was their ideal. And they actually, I can't remember if I said this or not in the screencast, but they actually started to round up Native Americans at one point and put them into what they called praying towns, which was basically foreshadowing reservations. And that went over really, really poorly. Imagine being told by people that just arrived on your shores, hey, we're going to round you up and force you to believe a certain way. It's not going to go over very well. So there ends up being conflict. Yet again, the English people are not going to want to share land. They're going to be pushing groups like the Wampanoags out. And King Philip's War is going to be kind of the climax of that conflict. And in the end, what happened, or at the beginning, and I can't remember, Metacom, yeah, that was his actual name, but the English called him King Philip. He is going to launch raids on so many Puritan towns and basically push all of the English back to Boston. And then smallpox kind of takes its toll, and the people now gather in Boston kind of regroup, and then they push King Philip back. They behead him and put his name on his head on a post, and they rip apart his body using horses and ropes. That's called being drawn and quartered, if you ever heard of that. And basically, Native Americans gave up after that and pushed west they are, just like always. Again, foreshadowing things like Indian Removal Act, Trail Tiers, reservation system. So that trend continues. It was not exclusive to the southern colonies. It wasn't exclusive to Andrew Jackson. You saw it all over the place. Okay. Now, the most ahead of their time of all of the groups, and they tended to settle in Pennsylvania, which was among the middle colonies, will be the Quakers. So when it comes to tolerance, the Quakers believed in religious freedom. They believed in equality between all groups of people, whether they be white or people of color, and that included Native Americans. If you remember correctly, if they wanted land from Native Americans, then they would pay them fairly for it. They would babysit each other's children. They got along well. And the Quakers, again, being so tolerant, they were okay with basically women having leadership roles. When they had church services, women were welcome to speak as much as men, which is way out of the norm for the time period. And remember, they settled mainly in Pennsylvania. William Penn namesake of Pennsylvania. He was a Quaker. So why does Pennsylvania eventually have things like slavery? And why does Pennsylvania eventually have things like, mistreatment of the Native Americans? Because it did not start out that way. Let me ask it a different way. Why does Pennsylvania, although founded largely on tolerance of all groups, become pretty intolerant over time? Throw out a guess.
Maybe because European people started to settle in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, is that Leah again? Because I don't see a name.
No, it's Addie.
Addie, okay. Good, you got that right. So basically they say, we don't care what country you're from. Again, they believe in equality of races, sexes. They believe in equality between them and Native Americans. And they didn't really care what country you were from. They're extremely tolerant. So they said, come one, come all. And then people from all kinds of other countries start to come in. And all of a sudden the Quakers find themselves outnumbered by the intolerant groups who are bringing slaves with them. So their intolerance, in a sense, backfires because they welcome in the intolerant groups. And then you see mistreatment of Native Americans and slavery even take hold in Pennsylvania. Of course, slavery will end in Pennsylvania eventually, but that's after the revolution. Okay, Sai, I think you brought this up earlier. Okay, so remember that eventually once the colonies start to get established, there's gonna be what's known as triangular trade. And to be honest, I think the triangle that I did with you all was the one that kind of starts here. If you look at the mouse, then it went to Africa, to the Caribbean, which was called the West Indies at the time, back to the colonies. But if you look, there's multiple triangles like the one I'm outlining now. And then you see like this one right here. I mean, so there's multiple triangles, but the point is that there is a major network of trade going on across the Atlantic Ocean that involves the New World and the Old World. It involves Europe, it involves Africa, it involves the West Indies, Caribbean, and the English colonies along the east coast of what became the United States. And it could involve raw materials coming from the colonies and going to England. By the way, how did England want to control this trade so they could maximize how much money they're making off the colonies and win the mercantilist game? Remember the name of the laws that get passed eventually?
I believe they were the Navigation Acts.
Very good, the Navigation Acts. Like you can only sell certain goods to Britain, or if you're selling a good to another country, like say Spain, well, you got to take your stuff to Britain first and get taxed, and you can go to Spain, and you can only use English ships. But the most notorious part of triangular trade was this right here. If you're looking here, which also is here. Sometimes slaves went to the Caribbean, did sugarcane before they went to the English colonies. Less of the time they went directly to the English colonies. But either way, slave traders start to make a lot of money off of this, and you start to see what you see on the image on the right, where, see, how do I put this? Like if you were a tractor trailer company, you would want to, as efficiently as possible, pack as much product into your tractor trailers as possible. And basically, these slave traders took the same attitudes towards Africans, but the big difference being these are human beings, right? Not just products as they were treated. And a lot of them end up dying along the way. It was a very nasty, inhumane, unhygienic way of transporting people that weren't even being treated as people. So remember that, what was this area here known as, where the slaves are coming through?
The Middle Passage.
Good. I didn't see who that was. The name didn't pop up, but is that Jason?
Yes.
I recognize your name. Okay, good. Anyway, so yeah, the Middle Passage was very notorious. And if you had been with me in class, I would have shown you like a pretty extended video of that explained the nature of it and how nasty it was. Okay. So mercantilism itself, I look for lots of images to kind of represent ideas that I'm trying to explain. This is by far the best and maybe the only really efficient one that I've found for mercantilism. You got a mother country. They want to be wealthy. They want to be the wealthiest. Again, one way to be the wealthiest, and they equate wealth with power. And so one way to become wealthy is to gather up all the gold and silver, which might be in the New World colonies. Gather stuff you can't create for yourself, like food items or raw materials from the colonies, so you don't have to buy them from other countries. And that enriches the mother country. Now, notice, and this is what I like about this cartoon. Looking at the imagery here, what is the relationship between the colonies and the mother country?
The colonies were like servants to the mother country.
Yeah, perfect. The colonies were servants. How does that go against how the colonists felt they should be treated? Remember that the colonists, even the indentured servants, came over with the idea that was established whenever Virginia Company was made, with this idea that they would have the rights of
The rights of an Englishman.
rights of Englishmen. Does this look like you have the same rights as Englishmen? No, you're a slave, or not a slave, but you're a servant. Okay, and of course, eventually the colonists are going to get fed up with that kind of relationship as it becomes more apparent to them, like when they start losing local control with things like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, the Proclamation of 1763, all that. And they're going to say, what happened to our rights as Englishmen? So that's another cause of the American Revolution. Okay. Oh, there's the Navigation Acts. So the Navigation Acts basically was a system of laws. I've already explained it earlier, but basically it was an attempt of the English government to tighten their grip on the colonies to profit themselves. It was very much in line with the ideals of mercantilism. And the laws included things, like I said before, like certain things could only be sold to England. Certain items could be sold to other countries, but they had to be taxed in England first. You had to basically pay for English shipping to get it done, hence the New England ships being used a lot for the shipping. But it was to funnel as much wealth and money into the colonies as possible. Now, the colonists didn't like that, because if you got a ton of tobacco and you've already sold all you can to England, what are you going to do with your leftovers? You want to sell it somewhere else, but you don't have to pay a tax to do it. I don't even think you're allowed to sell it anywhere else, but even if you could, you'd have to pay a tax first. So what do you resort to if you want to trade and get around the Navigation Acts?
Smuggle.
Smuggle. You sneak the stuff. And so the government, and I think it was James II at this point, he was a pretty, you can almost say abusive leader. He's very much controlling. And so he starts to really crack down on the Navigation Acts. Remember, he strips all of New England that was doing all the smuggling of their local government, puts in like basically a military governor in its place, consolidates all of the colonies into one big group called the Dominion of New England. And that could have possibly led to a revolution eventually, but James II gets removed from power and England backs off. Does that foreshadow something that King George III is going to do later on? That's a yes.
Is it the replacement of soldiers in Homestead Act?
Not Homestead Act. That's much later. But you do have the soldiers being put in place to enforce rules like the Tea Act or the Stamp Act or the Intolerable Acts. You've got the Quartering Act where you had to house soldiers. So basically, when King George III comes along, he does the same thing where he clamps down, but he never lets up in time. And because he clamped down so hard, he creates a revolt, which becomes known as the American Revolution, which is interesting because it starts out as a revolution over like things like taxes and smuggling and local government, and it becomes much more a revolution about ideals and what kind of government we're going to replace England's government with. Who wrote the pamphlet that basically said this is why we should become independent, but also this is what new government we should form in its place?
Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine, who wrote?
Common Sense.
Common Sense. Good. I'm glad you guys are getting it's coming together for you. Okay. So like I said before, leading up to the revolution, like 1730s-ish, so maybe 40, 50 years, between 30 and 50 years before the American Revolution, the Puritans and descendants are not going to be as religious. There's going to be a decline in religious fervor, and what you'll see is what's known as the Great Awakening. Now we would call it the First Great Awakening because we know that there's other Great Awakenings that happen later, but this was one that happened in the English colonies. Why does that matter? Because people are going to, this is going to lead to some changes in how people, quote, did religion. So you're going to see kind of a rejection of old religious norms and the bringing in of new religious norms, a questioning of church authority. And if you can question church authority, then you can question political authority, like that coming from King George III later on. But also, does this start to, one of the big things is that the American colonies, the English colonies, are starting to form their own identity the longer that they go on running themselves. Is that going to make England's government and England's king seem more foreign to them? Yes. They're starting to form their own identity, and the more that they form their own identity, the more they feel like they should be their own country eventually, especially when King George III starts to kind of abuse his power. Okay, remember that this revolution is largely ideological, and it largely is influenced by an intellectual movement that starts in Europe and spreads to the colonies, and that'll be the Enlightenment. You can always remember who John Locke is because he had the long locks of hair. Actually, that doesn't help you remember anything about him other than his picture, so you can just drop that. But basically, he is going to the movement is going to emphasize reason. It's going to emphasize science. It is going to downplay religion, which will eventually lead to feed into your Second Great Awakening, which comes later. But it also brought into light the idea of natural rights. Now, John Locke, what were the 3 natural rights that he said people were born with?
Life, liberty, and property.
Life, liberty, and property.
Property.
That is what you said, right?
I said happiness.
Oh, pursuit of happiness. That's where Thomas Jefferson kind of plagiarizes Locke in the Declaration of Independence. He copies him, except he says pursuit of happiness instead of property. And for some people, I guess gaining property is considered pursuing happiness, which is kind of sad, but Anyway, so when the American Revolution comes along, a lot of it is because people feel like not only are the rights of Englishmen being violated, not only is local rule being violated, but they're being deprived of life. Look at the Boston Massacre, for example. They're being deprived of liberty. Remember, they're being overrun by soldiers. They're being deprived of property. Look at all the taxes on all the items that they have. And so that also feeds into the coming of the American Revolution. And this also relates to, I'm getting ahead of myself. But again, there's this idea that you have the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, since I've already gone over that, let me dig a little deeper. In what way once the United States formed, in what way, and Thomas Jefferson himself was guilty of this, did the colonists, some of them, in what way were they hypocritical about natural rights?
They own slaves.
If you own slaves, then you're depriving them sometimes of life because, sometimes you were allowed legally to kill your slave without getting punished. Liberty is another word for freedom. Did slaves have that?
No.
Nope. And not only did they not really have property, they were considered to be property. And if you go to Jefferson's words instead of Locke's words, were they allowed to pursue happiness?
No.
The only way they could pursue happiness pretty much would be by running away, and that would lead to a threat on their life. So that was a big glaring hypocrisy. And basically, like in the same document, Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence is going to say that all men are created equal, and then simultaneously says that we're entitled to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But you see the inconsistency there because he wasn't referring to all men, apparently. not people of color. Well, not people of African descent. Okay, so finally, another part, and this is one that people always forget. I don't know why, but even like when I taught AP, that they would forget this one. Remember that natural rights fees, there's kind of something that comes out of natural rights, and that is, okay, what's the role of government in natural rights? And it's pretty simple. The role of government and natural rights is to protect the citizens' natural rights, protect our life, liberty, and our pursuit of happiness / property. And today we live in a government that ideally, and not entirely, but for the most part, lives up to a lot of the idea of giving people life. I'm not going to get into death penalty and abortion, which are divisive issues, so that could be debatable, depending on how you feel. Liberty, there's a lot of freedom emphasized in the United States. And then property, the Constitution protects your property rights. The only way that you can have property taken would be through eminent domain, but then you get compensated for it, but that's a whole other issue. So right now, there's not much of a push for saying, oh, our natural rights aren't being protected, let's overthrow the government. However, during the time of the American Revolution, absolutely. Okay, and that's actually part of the argument in the Declaration of Independence, as Jefferson goes on to say that basically England's not obeying compact theory, and then he lists out all the things King George III has authorized to call him out for breaking compact theory, and concludes that we should declare independence. Finally, let's lay the groundwork for something else for the First Amendment, and that would be the freedom of the press. So there's going to be a trial in which basically a guy criticized the governor of New York that had been appointed by the king, and he was right in what he was saying. He was not lying. He still was put on trial for it, and the jury found him not guilty, again, laying the groundwork for freedom of the press. And I do want to caution you, thinking of current events. There's a lot of talk about quote unquote fake news these days. And it's not the first time that's happened. You've had fake news for a long time. It used to be called yellow journalism. In the 1890s, you had what was called yellow journalism, same idea. And you've got tabloids, you got like the National Enquirer and stuff that, those magazines that you see whenever you're at the grocery store. But here's the thing. And this is something to kind of digest, this is a larger contemporary issue, is that if we lose all faith in any news that we just don't like, and we only listen to what we already agree with rather than what's necessarily true, are we in a roundabout way getting rid of freedom of the press? If the press can only survive by saying what you want to hear, do we really have freedom of the press anymore? So that's something to think about. And that's not targeting anything politically. Fake news is a term that's getting used not just in the United States now, and again, it's been used before in, say, like the 1890s, it was yellow journalism. You've seen like 1800s campaign, remember they're putting in newspapers lies about Jefferson, lies about Adams, so you've seen it all the time. So just be critical of the news, I would say, but look at multiple sources so you can gather the most accurate information possible. And with that soapbox moment, I'm going to stop the recording